Got it. All right, we're getting started. We are sharing the screen. I'm going to start chapter 5 today. There's actually more stuff to do with chapter 3 and 4, but I personally have a desire to get moving. It's Purim Katan. It was Purim Katan today during the daytime outside of Yerushalayim. Tonight is Purim Katan here, and there are echoes or foreshadowing of the Purim story in chapter 5. So that's where we're going. I'm going to read you the text. We'll ask some questions. We'll delve into a few things here and there. That's going to be today's shiur. So, Belshazzar, wait a second. Up until now, we've been hearing about Nebuchadnezzar. Who the heck is this Belshazzar Malka? Belshazzar the king. Okay. Avad lechem rav, the Rav Nohe, he made bread. In other words, he made a big suda, a big meal for his chieftains. Now, is the aleph on the bread? Is the aleph on for 1,000 of his closest officers and ministers, etc. Kavel alpha chamra shate, and in together with that, or opposite of that, right? In parallel to this big meal, they also drank 1,000 measures of wine. So if it's 1,000 people, 1,000 measures of wine, just one measure of wine per person, it's not too bad unless you're talking about, a huge measure. And then the next verse goes on and it says, this is, by the way, Belshazzar. Notice the name that was given to Daniel was Belteshazzar. There's a tet there. This is Belshazzar. He's called the king. Most of the Mefarshim that I looked at point out that more contemporary Mefarshim, let's put it that way, Rav Steinsaltz and some others, point out that in the Babylonian records themselves, he is mentioned as the son of a king whose name was Nunian, who doesn't show up in our Sfarim at all. So it may be a different name for somebody else. And he only is called Ben Melech. He's never actually listed as a king. He doesn't show up in the Greek histories, which if he had never actually been the king himself, if rather he was, like the Prince Regent was in England in the 1700s, etc. There was a king who was incompetent, and so the son takes over for the king. The dynasty is dying out here. We have skipped over all the rest of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Daniel gets, the very beginning of the book, right? Daniel gets taken to Bavel. And this is before the destruction, probably about 11 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which would have put it about the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So the Beit HaMikdash gets destroyed in about year 18. Nebuchadnezzar, according to most timelines that we have, reigned for 45 years, which means that after the destruction of the temple, he reigned for an additional 27 years. The story with that big tselem in Bikat Dura, and there's a great story from the Gemara that I need to bring you all on that. but I'm going to do that on another class. That seemingly took place sometime after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and that was when Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah were thrown into Kibshan Ha'esh, etc., etc. The second dream. So the first dream took place during that 11 years between the time that Daniel was taken to Babel and the destruction. Then the next story, and then we have this letter that got put into Sefer Daniel, this letter from Nebuchadnezzar, where he explains that he had another dream. He ended up calling on Daniel to explain what the dream was. The dream was that he was going to suffer a punishment from God. Daniel offered him a way out, which he took advantage of for about a year, and then it's like, I'm on top of the world. I don't need to mess with this tzedakah business anymore. I don't need to show in any way that I am subservient to the God of the Jews. I destroyed his temple. I have all his people in, as my slaves, as my dependent on me. I'm in charge of the world down here, and nothing can really hurt me. And the minute he did that, the punishment that he had seen in his dream fell upon him, took 7 years out of his rule, and presumably his son ruled in his place. Somebody ruled in his place. And then he recovers, and he at least lip service acknowledges God. And he writes this letter, and that's the last we hear of him. Now, he reigns for probably another 15, 20 years, but we don't hear anything more about him. We don't hear anything about any of the interim kings. This story is the story, I'll give it away, right? It's the story of the handwriting on the wall, which is an expression that has come from Sefer Daniel, from the story, to mean, to have great mashma'ut. It has great meaning for everybody. It's like you can't see the handwriting on the wall. In other words, you can't see what's coming at you. You're so blinded, you're so tied into yourself that you can't see what's coming. That's sort of the meaning in English of saying what you can't see, the handwriting on the wall. The handwriting on the wall it's there, it's clear, but there are people who are blind to it. And that's, of course, what we're going to hear in this chapter. We're going to hear the details of it. In addition, it's not just that it became an expression in English. It served as inspiration for all sorts of art through all the various eras, prior to the Renaissance, in the Renaissance. Since then, it's a story that has a great deal of artistic and dramatic interest. And so it's something that's sort of become part of Western culture. But at the moment, we have this Belshazzar, who may or may not have actually been a king. Our story, our book calls him, is going to call him the son of Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to hear that in this next verse. Belshazzar Amar Bit'em Chamra La Haitaya Lamane Dahava Vakasba Di Handpek Nebuchadnezzar avuhi min heichal di b'Yerushalayim. Belshazzar said, under the influence of the wine, to have brought the kalim, the vessels that of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar had taken. Nebuchadnezzar, and here it says his father. The Mefarshim say, no, it's not his father. It was his grandfather. It was his ancestor, right? It was his grandfather. Basically, maybe a great-grandfather, but probably a grandfather, from the temple that was in Jerusalem. Vayishton bahon malka v'rav vanohi sheglate ulchinate. And not only did he have them brought to this mishta, but they drank from them, the king and all of his chieftains' officers and their women and their, the word starts with a P in English. Actually, it doesn't start with a P, concubines. Not sure why I wanted it to start with a P. Okay. And Badayin Haitiv Mane Dahava Dihan Pakul Min Hechala Di Beit Alakad Di B'Yerushalayim. So then, in fact, they brought the kalim, the vessels of gold, specifically. What happened to the silver? We can ask that question ourselves, that were taken out of the temple that was in the house of God. So the Heichal, the inner part of the temple that was in the house of God that was in Jerusalem. The Ishtiv Bahon Malka V'Rav Sheglata ul Chenate. So seems to be a repetition. So maybe you can read the first verse as saying he said to have it brought in order that they could drink, although that's not actually what the Aramaic says. And it says, and then in fact, it all took place, including drinking out of these kalim. I'm going to do the first 4 verses because in addition to questions that arise to me out of the story, etc., we also have Malbim's questions, and that's what I'm going to ask. So it says, Ishtiv Chamra, they drank wine. V'shabachu lela he dahava v'kaspa nachasha parzela a'a v'avna. They drank the wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, copper and iron, wood and stone. Okay, on those, so you can ask, like, what was in his mind? Why did he do it? Why Dafka then? What? And the business of having the women come and also drink out of the kalim. So some of the Mefarshim, I'm not sure if Malbim is going to go there. We'll see. But some of the Mefarshim that I've looked at have said, like, it was not common in those days for men and women, particularly to drink together. For the king and queen to share a small meal together, that was one thing. But in matters of state, the wife, okay, was the women had their own party and the men had their own party. It was a way of preserving a certain amount of modesty, and seeing as they drank a great deal, it was a way of preserving, a certain amount of decorum that if the men and women had been mixed together might have become very problematic, and it probably prevented a lot of fighting over the women, etc. And you should be hearing the echoes, of course, between this and the beginning of the Megillat Esther story. where Achashverosh had decided that he was going to have a meal. He was going to have a great big thing. Forget a one-day event with 1,000 people. It was a 180-day event. The Mefarshim and the Megillah tell us that that when the wine was given Kiyad HaMelech, but Ein Ones, the Kiyad HaMelech, they had these very large cups, whatever, not cups, like boots, but like huge things that they would fill with wine. And they had sort of a drinking party kind of game where you would have to, everybody would pour something into the one person's cup, and he would have to drink the whole thing down, and he'd be lucky, you can get alcohol poisoning from that much alcohol. And so by Achashverosh's party, we were told that on the one hand, they were given those great big cups, but on the other hand, there was no onus, there was no forcing, there was no pressure to actually finish the whole thing. You could drink as much of it or as little of it as you wanted. But we also saw in Megillat Esther that it was just for the men, and that Vashti was making a party for the women, a separate party for the women. So this business of bringing the women in is already another form, essentially, of bizayon. It's not enough that they took something that had been holy. Remember, we heard that Nebuchadnezzar had taken the stuff and he brought it, and he did, in a sense, was giving honor to the pagan gods. Nebuchadnezzar was, and he brought it to their temple, to sort of display and say, here, see, we have conquered this other god. Here are the things which were holy to this other god, and we are bringing them before you, our gods, whatever. But then he took them and he put them in a storehouse. They weren't to be used. Occasionally to be displayed, perhaps, but only in, even by their standards, only in something that was considered holy, and not to be brought to a raucous drinking party and then to even go against the typical norms of. Now, I'm thinking of paras when I'm thinking of people who tended to be more tzniut. That's something that Chazal say about paras, and this is still the costume. This is still Bavel. So maybe they don't have that same aspect of modesty in the way they eat and drink and interact as the Persians later on do. But nonetheless, it's pretty ingrained in this part of the world that women are in a harem, the women are, it's ingrained in general in this part of the world that they're not together. And the fact that they bring them together it should be also something that is raising questions. The questions the Malbim brings, of course, are going to be a little more particular to the language, because he's very careful about that. But he does start off with exactly the same first question. Why did he make this meal? You would expect to hear a reason. In Megillat Esther, we hear a reason as to why Achashverosh makes his Suda for the 6 months. Okay. Why does Belshazzar make this meal? What's going on? Is it the meal when he becomes king? Is it like, what's going on, right? Why did he command to bring the kelim of the Heichal dafka to this meal, okay, which is not something that's normal. It should, for them to be on display, even that's already like a step beyond. They tended to do exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did. He brought them, he displayed them briefly in the temple, and he put them into a treasure house. What's the point of bringing them out, and specifically to this kind of a meal? Lama amar techila la'atuye mane dahava v'kasba, and afterwards, right, this is a bruk shekibanti, right? And why did he originally say to bring the kelim of both gold and silver? And in the end, it only talks about the gold ones. In the beginning, he said from the Heichal, which was in Yerushalayim. And then in the next verse, it says from the Heichal of the house of God that was in Jerusalem. Like, what is going on? What's the distinction that's being made here? Now, unlike the previous chapter where those were the words of Nebuchadnezzar, this is presumably the words of Daniel himself. Okay, I mean, he's kind of anonymous. We don't hear him say Ana Daniel, da 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 da, but there's a narrator who's, I mean, maybe this is a news item. If you think about somebody's diary, scrapbook kind of thing. So maybe he cut something out of the equivalent of the local press and he put it in. But the chances are that this is what Daniel himself wrote. And so what is the distinction? Is this actually a distinction in the words of Belshazzar himself? Or is this a distinction that Daniel wants us to hear? Okay. And I don't know that I have tremendous need to hear the Malbim's answers to these questions just yet. I want to get the story developed a little more. And so that's often what I've been doing in this class, is that we develop the story up to a certain point, and then we go and we think about what is, what's going on that we don't expect, or either in the language or in the storyline or whatever. And then we come back and we take a look at what various of our Mefarshim have had to say about it. And so that's what I'm going to do here also. So now I'm going to do the next several verses, and I'm going to scroll through the Malbim to get to where his next set of questions are, which is a question just on this next verse, which is Ba Sha'ata. Okay, it's like the Hebrew bozmani, at that very moment. Okay, Nafaka etzba'an diyad anash. At that very moment, there came out a finger of a human hand. The katvan lekavel nevrashta algira diktal hechala dimalka. And it wrote sort of opposite the nivreshet, okay, it's a chandelier, okay? So it was the chandelier's hanging down here, and I don't know if you can see me, and I can't see what I'm doing. I need to switch this so that I can also see my own hands to make sure that you can see my hands. Okay, so let's say that there's this chandelier hanging here, and the hand is opposite the chandelier, and all there is the hand, just the finger of the hand, actually, okay? Just the finger, and the finger is writing on the the gear on gear is the word we use for chalk, right? On the plaster of the wall in the palace of the king. And the Malka Chazeh Pas Yada Dikatva. And the king sees the sort of the hand as it's writing. Or he sees like the back hand. So the finger is what's doing the writing, and he sees the back, this part of the hand. I don't know about you, but a disembodied hand, it's sort of like the Cheshire cat, right? The disembodied head, there's what happened to the body. It's like, but a hand that doesn't have a body attached to it, that doesn't that's moving, that's writing. It's not that it just got cut off and all of a sudden it's hanging there in the air. It's like, oh my goodness. So the Malbim's question on this is, in the beginning, it says that fingers came forth. That's ba'an, plural or singular. Okay, the fingers came forth. The implication being it's only the fingers, right? And afterwards, it says that he saw the pas of the yad. Okay, so which sounds like it's the whole hand. Okay, that's what I was, when I was trying to demonstrate it, I was, here we go. I was saying, he saw the pas, this part of the hand, not just the fingers. So
the yad of the Torah reading. It's
right.
Like the back of the hand. Yes.
Right. So that's the right. So the pas of the hand. So that's interesting. It's an interesting connection. Okay. So, so on this one, I do want to read you the answer, because the question struck me also. It's like, where do you get, what's going on? Okay. So, he says that you can't say that it just appeared to him in his imagination, or that his senses led him astray, or that one of the enemies, one of the officers or the ministers, whatever, was an enemy of the king, that he wrote this in order to scare the king or whatever, because it's going to tell us in a little bit that it wasn't just the king who saw it. That's what we heard in the first verse. Okay. And the king probably had his initial take on this is going to be, I've had too much to drink. Right? It's like pink elephants. It's like, I have had way too much to drink. There's a disembodied hand that's writing on the wall opposite me. Okay. That's got to be his initial thing, that my senses are all messed up, or it's my imagination, I'm hallucinating, whatever, If it was just that all of a sudden the writing appeared on the wall, so it, somebody could have done that ahead of time, right? In other words, you could write something with lemon juice, let's say, and then if you wave a torch in front of it, it'll make it come out brown. Okay, that was one of our favorite ways of doing invisible writing. You would write a note to your friend, and if you wrote it in with lemon juice or something like that, when it dried, you couldn't see anything. And if they held it up to a light bulb, would be even enough heat to turn it brown, and then you could see it, right? So, that's the thing that the Malbim is suggesting is maybe it was, maybe it was an enemy of the king, and it's just the writing appeared, but that's not what happened. Okay. What's the next verse? Adayin Malka Zivoi Shnohi Rainohi Valuna. Okay. So now the king is, he's totally, outside himself. It's like, oh my goodness. The kitre charza mishtarin v'arkuta da ledan nakshin. Okay. That one I wanted to say. So basically his, like the Zivohi, like his whole face, his whole appearance changed. And his thoughts were like, he was, my English word for it is he was discombobulated. Okay. And the, wait a second. And the, kitre chartse mishtarin. Okay. When somebody, I mean, it's a little gross. I apologize. Okay. If you've been eating and drinking a lot, you can sometimes lose control of your bowels. And it's like the ties of his lower part of his clothing became untied. And anyway, yes. So he lost control of his bowels. That's how scared he was by seeing this hand. And Kare Malka Bachaya Lehala Ashfaya Kasdaya Kaste Gazraya. Okay, we've heard some of these words before. So he called out in great fear to have brought into him, and who did he call to? The soothsayers and necromancers and fortune tellers and all the same sorts of people that Nebuchadnezzar had called when he'd had that bad dream. So it's the same vocabulary. And so he raises his voice and he says to the wise men of Babel, di kol enash, di yikre katava dana ufishre yechavinani, argvana yilbash, v'hamnicha di dahava al tzavere v'talte b'malchute yishla. And so he says to all of them that any person who can read the writing so that he at least knows what's being said and explain it, right? The Pishrei again, who can tell me about it. So that person will wear argvan. Will wear the royal purple. And this hamnicha is, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it. This is, the picture is not so easy to, here we go, get it opposite the camera. It's a picture of, it was probably with gold. Well, it says actually that it was with gold. It was a necklace sort of thing, okay, with row upon row upon row, and then the outer link. So it was this sort of collar made of gold. That's this hamnicha of gold around his neck, and the Talti b'malchuta yishlat, and he will rule over a third of the kingdom. I'll give up a whole third of the kingdom to him. Now, if the other officers, if the other people who were there had not seen the handwriting on the wall and the king made this call, et cetera, you would expect what? That people would say, why don't you go to sleep? When you wake up, it'll all be okay. You know, you're having DTs. DTs is English abbreviation for, actually, it's a Latin phrase meaning delirium tremens. It means that you're hallucinating because of an overabundance of alcohol. But But nobody says that to him, okay? Because everybody else sees the words on the wall also, and evidently everybody else also saw the hand, the disembodied hand, because, and that's what Malbim is saying to us, is that you might have thought that it was hallucination, that his senses were taking, were, that he misinterpreted something, that he was seeing the shadow that was being cast by the chandeliers, by the candles, etc., or that one of his officers who didn't really like him had decided to play a prank on him. And so that's why it says later on that all of the officers saw the fingers writing. And many people can't be mistaken, right? Nor, we sometimes talk about sort of mass hallucination. In other words, where one person has it, and if everybody is in some state of, oh man, my English has gone today. Sorry. I could say this in Hebrew, but it's not going to help. It is possible in a sense to sort of catch somebody else's hallucination. That's not the right word for it, but where everybody is in a state of, I think the word starts with an S, but of course the last time I thought it started with a P and it started with a C, so that's not necessarily a good thing. Susceptibility. It did start with an S. There we go. Sorry about that. Right. That it's possible that if everybody's in a particular susceptible state, that one person can have a hallucination and the other people around that person can sort of join in and have a similar kind of hallucination. But it would really require that the first person talk about it and say stuff about it, and then the others sort of catch it from that. And in this case, everybody saw it at the same time. Secondly, it says that it was opposite the chandelier. It was opposite the light. Okay, so there was plenty of light. It wasn't like it was in the shadow or in a place where you might, sometimes things that are in the shadowy part of the room, you start to imagine things that are there, like kids who get concerned about things that are under the bed or whatever, right? It's scary. It's under the bed. And so so Malbim is saying it wasn't like that, because it was, here was the chandelier and here is the writing, and it's very clear. The light is right on it. It's not like you can miss what's going on. And it was written on the plaster. Okay. And the plastered part of the wall, it was really up high, right? Because the chandelier is up high. You don't want the chandelier down where you're going to catch your hair on fire, your clothes on fire or something. The chandelier is high. And so the handwriting was up high. That's the point of telling you that it was. So there were two reasons for telling you that it was opposite the light. One reason for telling you it was opposite the light is that it wasn't a trick of shadows or something like that. It was clear as day. And secondly, that it was opposite the light up there on the plaster is that it was high up, not a place where a person could be writing, I don't know, and somehow maybe be wearing some, like if you were in the shadows, etc., you could be wearing clothes that blended in with the shadow and just have just the arm, in glitter or something, so that so that it would catch all the light and draw all the attention to that. And really there would be a person behind it, but, but it wasn't like that. That's what Malbim was telling us. It wasn't like that. It couldn't be that somebody was just trying to play a trick on him. And he realized that because the whole thing was well lit up, including where the hand stopped or where the fingers stopped. It was up too high for it to be a person, and it was all lit up. So it's not like somebody could have, disappeared themselves. I've seen something about how they do certain stunts in movies and stuff, and they do like have somebody dress in a particular color, and then they use a filter on their cameras so that that color doesn't photograph, so then it appears like that part of the person or that person altogether isn't in the scene. And so that's one of the ways that they get some very dramatic scenes to be photographed. But while you could do that if you were trying to make a movie of this, that's not what was happening then. Okay, because if you were there on the set of the movie, you would actually see the person. It's only the camera that doesn't see the person. Okay. But if you were there, you would see the person. And so again, it can't be that this is somebody who is. So you've ruled out hallucination, right? And you've ruled out that my senses are misleading me because it's off in the shadow, because it's not off in the shadow. And you've ruled out that it's by human agency of any kind whatsoever. And so you're left with either divine or some other kind of supernatural agency going on here, right? And so the fourth thing, though, that the Malbim brings is that, by the way, it was also the officers, they didn't see only, the officers saw only the fingers writing. It was the king who saw the entire hand that was writing. And the fact that they both saw but didn't quite see exactly the same thing, he says, the Malbim says, this is a different kind of miraculous nature to the event, because the seeing was different depending on who was seeing it. Okay, so let's go back again and look at this verse. Why is Malbim so insistent that everybody saw it? Right? Because it doesn't actually say that in the verse. In the verse, it says, at that moment, the fingers, there came out these fingers from the hand of a human hand, okay, not fingers of some other kind of being. And they wrote opposite the chandelier, opposite the light, on the plaster of the wall of the palace, of the king's palace. Okay? It doesn't say that anybody saw it. It just says it happened. And then it says, and the king saw the whole hand that was writing. So Malbim is insistent, along with Chazal, that everybody did see it, but we didn't actually hear that in the verse. So let's keep going on with the story, because it's a very exciting story, and we should at least get to some kind of closure. Oops, don't want that open. Please go away. Thank you. So nice when it does things like that. So, Okay, so Malbim isn't going to share any more questions with us until we get up to verse 9, which I don't think we were quite that far yet. We got to the point where he had made the offer, right? He had called all of he'd called the various different kinds of soothsayers, fortune tellers, etc. They all came. He made them this offer, and up to rule over a third of the kingdom, right? To remind you of, of Achashverosh. He actually offered half the kingdom. The price goes up, and so then all of these wise men, right? And Dayan, Alin kol chachimei malka, v'la kahalin katava l'mikre, ufishre lahoda'a l'malka. So then all of the wise people come in and they look at the wall, and they were not able to read the writing. Nobody said that there wasn't writing. Nobody said it was invisible. I can't read it because what are you talking about? They couldn't read what was written. They couldn't read the letters. They weren't familiar with the alphabet, or it didn't make sense of the words, and they certainly couldn't explain it to make it known to the king. Dain Malcha Belshazzar Sagi Mitvehel Zivohi Shnin Elohi. So then the king Belshazzar is even more upset, okay, than he was before, and his appearance of his face changed yet again, okay. And not only that, but also Rav Navohi Mishtabshin. But also his chieftains were all in a tumult. Okay, they didn't know. Right, they also were very confused. Malkata. The Kavel Mile Malka, Rav Navohi Levet Mishtaya Allah. Anat Malkta Va'ameret Malka La'almin Chi Al Yivaluch Rayonich Zivech Al Ish Tano. So the queen had been present. One suggestion was because the words earlier were about Shegel v'Chanit, right? Is that the language? Let me take a look. Yes, Shegleta u'Chenate. So Shegleta are women who have more the status of wives. Cheneta are the concubines. And you see this in Targum Onkelos and other Targumim. But here she's called a queen, and it didn't say before that the queen was there. So one parish that I saw suggested that this is maybe the queen mother. In other words, this is not Belshazzar's wife. This is Belshazzar's mother, who may in fact be the queen, right? If Belshazzar is in fact really only a regent, it could be that his mother is still the queen and that he's not really the king, he's just the regent, and that his mother, the queen, so she had been in an inner room. He called for some of the women to come, but she maybe felt that it was more appropriate for her to maintain her. Right? It's like lahavdil, but it's what David HaMelech says, kol kvuda bat melech panima, that all of the honor and the glory of the daughter of a king, okay, is inward, is internal, is to be kept for the more private place. And so she now comes out from that place, okay, because maybe there are curtains or something, and she can see what's going on. She can hear what's going on. And she sees how upset, and particularly if this is her son, this is the kind of thing that would bring a mother out, I would say. And so the queen, after hearing these words of the king and of his chieftains, entered into the Beit Mishteh. She goes to the place where the meal is. She had not been there until now. That's my point. And she raises her voice and she says, "O king, you should live forever." We heard this phrase earlier. This is how people address kings. Don't be so discombobulated in your thoughts, nor should your appearance change, like turn pasty white or whatever is going on. Rather, itai gvar b'malchutach diruach alakin kadishin be. There is a person in your kingdom. I mean, it doesn't occur to Belshazzar. So Belshazzar is enough past the time of Nebuchadnezzar. We heard that Daniel served in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. We don't really hear anything about what's going on afterwards. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar has passed away. There has been at least one more king since then. And Daniel's in some kind of retirement. Okay. And to the point that there's almost, there have been so many echoes, of course, of the Joseph story here as well in Sefer Daniel. It's just like, and there arose a king who didn't know Yosef. Okay. Here's Belshazzar. He doesn't know that Daniel exists. The queen, or the queen mother, which makes more sense because she would be from a prior generation and would have remembered about Daniel. She says, there's a man in your kingdom that the spirit of the holy God is in him. Ubiyome avuch nehiru v'sachlatanu v'chachma kachachmat alakim. And in the days of your father, in the days of your ancestor, okay, his wisdom was like the wisdom of God, and he made things clear and understandable. That kind of wisdom was found within him, in this person. Umalcha Nebuchadnezzar avuch Rav Chartumin, Ashvin, Chasdein, Gazrin, Hakime avuch Malka. And Nebuchadnezzar, literally it says your father, your ancestor, okay, put him in charge, right, of all of the Chartumin, of all of these different kinds of soothsayers, some of whom we heard the Ashvin, we heard him call the Kasdin, we heard him call the Gazrin, we heard him call the Chartumin, we didn't hear him call, but lo mishana. So he put him in charge of all of these people. That's what your father, the king, did. Kol kavel di ruach yetira umanda v'sachlatanu mafasher chalmin v'achvat yad achidan umashare kitrin hishtakachat be. So then, because of this, right, so there was this extra level of spirit, of knowledge, okay? And with that, he was able to interpret dreams and to tell over riddles, okay, like chidot, okay, and to mishare kitrin, and to literally is to untie things which are tied, right? To untie the knots, okay, that are found in them. I mean, that's the literal language of it, right? He was able to explain away all of the difficulties. And this ability was found in this person. And we haven't named the person yet. Now we're going to name the person. But Daniel, Di Malka Sam Shmei Belshazzar. Okay, this person, Daniel, that the king gave him the name Belshazzar. Kan Daniel Yitkare Ufishre Yahacheve. So now let Daniel be called, and he will tell the solution to this handwriting on the wall. All right, how are we holding in terms of time? We are just about out of time. So seeing as we are just about out of time, I'm going to see if there were any more other kinds of questions to ask. Right. So this is typical Malbim. Why are you saying the same thing twice? Didn't you already say this? Okay. So back on verse 9, but I've come to a nice ending point in terms of the story. I'm going to leave you with the queen has suggested that they call Daniel. But we don't know what's been written yet. We don't know. And Daniel isn't on the scene yet, but he's about to be. And so this has been setting up everything for Daniel to show up. The Malbim's question on verse 9, which was, then the king was very discombobulated and his face changed, his appearance changed, but also his officers were scared, they were all in confusion also. And he says, isn't this the same thing that it said in verse 6? So in verse 6, it said, then the king, his appearance changed and his thoughts were all discombobulated. But it also went on and talked about his losing control of his bowels, etc. It didn't speak in verse 6. It did not speak about that the chieftains were also all upset. So there actually are some differences, certainly. But part of it, the business about being mitbahel, that root word, was certainly used in the earlier verse, and the business about his vizivohi shnina lohi, that his the glow of his countenance changed upon him. In other words, like like the blood drained from his face. That certainly was said earlier, and it's being said again, and so had something changed, like he'd come back to himself, and then when he made the offer to everybody else, and then when they weren't able to read it, then he got all confused again. But that's where we were, and we want to see if Malbim offers us any other questions on the stuff with the queen, etc. But only if the internet is going to agree to bring up the next part. Although I could read it out of the Sefer instead of showing it on the screen, because I do actually have it. So it says again in these verses, here we are, okay, in the verses 11 and 12, where the queen says that there's a person in your kingdom who has and she, in the first verse, she doesn't reveal his name, and then she seems to go, it like it says that he has the spirit of the holy God. And then here it says he has this extra spirit. It said that he was able to shed light, and he had great seichel and great chachma, and it repeats some of those same kinds of words. However, in verse 12, it talks about his being able to interpret dreams. But the Malbim wants to know, he asks it as a question, and you need to understand that with the Malbim, it's never a question. It's really always a statement. He says, are there in these verses duplication and excess and going on at length? Like, because there's an assumption, not as strong an assumption with Ketuvim as there is with Navi, and even in Navi, not as strong an assumption there as there is in the Torah, but there's an assumption that the law of parsimony to some extent still applies. Law of parsimony says about the Torah that there's not a single drop of ink in writing a Torah that's not absolutely necessary, not a single crown on a letter, nothing that's unnecessary. And so if it's said one way and not another way, if it appears that you could understand it without that word, then that word is there to teach something else. And that's absolutely true in Torah. And even in the rest of Nach, we have this sense that, and the Malbim in particular is very strong on this, has the sense that there are no words that are unnecessary. If the Navi says it, if in the Ketuvim it says it, it is because there is something there that's necessary. And so you shouldn't go on and on and on. This is not like Targum Sheni that goes on and on and on. Okay. This is Tanakh. And so it shouldn't be that it's going on and on. It should be that it's, rather, it should be that there's this, there needs to be meaning to it. And so when Malbim asks that question, it's not really a question. When Malbim asks that question, he says, it appears that there's duplication and going on at length unnecessarily. And I will now come and explain to you why each and every word there was in fact necessary and why it's actually saying different things. Okay. So that's the questions on the verses as far as we got. So we got through in fact, that's as far as we got. We just got through verse 12. And so next week, we'll take a look at some other things and we will move the story forward. Okay. And I'm going to stop my share. Here we go. And I'm going to